So I think it's worth now putting a few ideas into your mind about how we engage with the Australian Frontier Wars as a unit and how we engage with them as people. We could go off and learn the content of the Australian Frontier Wars without getting the essential messages. And if we were studying another unit, such as the Holocaust unit, and all you took away from it were just facts and figures and names and places and dates, you're probably missing the very essence of what that unit's about. So as we grapple with this, let's now have a look at what maybe you should take away from this and the process by which you're entering into. As you do your investigation into this unit, always make a point of thinking, am I honouring the vibrancy, the diversity, the complexity of the world of Australia's first people? Try to avoid those overly simplistic generalizations, those narrow stereotypes of what Indigenous Australia was. Honour the vibrancy, the diversity, the complexity of that world. As you engage with this unit, try to understand the context of the local space in which we live and operate. There is not one part, your head around this, not one part of the Australian continent that wasn't part of territory of First Nations and First Peoples. Now, as we really start looking at our backyards, at our school playgrounds, as our buildings and so on, that will possibly challenge us to think about how we feel and respond to this shared history. That the locations we're on are part of the story of dispossession, part of a story of replacement. As I enjoy my backyard, there's a space there. How do I respond to that? How do I think about it? How do I feel about that? As we look at our world, as we move about Australia, try to glimpse our nation today as First Nations saw it. Keep learning. As I move around my local area, I'm very much aware that the reserves, the parks, the waterways were all part of another nation, another space. Many state high schools and schools are built on public lands that were once campsites. Areas around Brisbane with the name reserve attached to it were once Aboriginal reserves, First Peoples territories for those campsites. Why is it that large parks like Victoria Park are where they are? Why is it the Brisbane exhibition grounds are where they are? They all have a purpose. The Roma Street parklands were once a fighting ground, as was the exhibition grounds, the showgrounds area. Where were the crossing points of the Brisbane River for the Turrbal people and the Yagara people? Well, it was actually quite close to where the Story Bridge is today. So try to get a glimpse, when you can discover it, of our First Nations world. It still exists, we just have to look for it. Try to take part in this shared Australian story by exploring the evidence. We're historians. Discover these true, if you like, authentic stories. A big theme in Frontier Wars history is the theme of truth-telling. There has been a great Australian silence where people haven't spoken about our stories, and by not speaking about, there's an element of deception. There's something liberating in coming clean, in telling the truth. But that truth is based upon evidence. We look at the evidence, we make decisions, and then think and feel about how we respond. A big term related to Frontier Wars history is a term called Makarrata. It's an Indigenous word coming from northwestern Australia, and it essentially means a coming together to resolve issues after conflict, a sharing of views, a sharing of truths to resolve and become stronger after conflict. And so that Makarrata term is one that I'm going to leave you with. It's a takeaway message. Now let's put a few more ideas in your head as we approach our investigations and as you grapple with sources, I'm wanting you to recognise, embrace and respect the diversity of all the experiences. This is an experience of all Australians. Life is and was always complex. It's not a simple story of good and evil. It's not a story about feeling good or feeling guilty. It's not about us and them. It's just about us. The frontier wars are a study in our humanity. There are murderers, there are heroes, there are warriors, there are cowards, there are victims, there are perpetrators, there are those who stand up and speak out about wrong actions, and there are those who turn the other way. There are those who are trapped into circumstance. There are those who have a lot of choices and choose not to do the right thing. The complexity of human experience is something we all share. The good and the bad is not limited to one group, one ethnicity, one side of the frontier. We can find all of that complexity on both sides. Just as it was important in studying the Holocaust in previous years not to position Jewish peoples as passive victims loaded on the trains, lambs to the slaughter. We've got to be very careful about ensuring that we don't position First Peoples, our Indigenous Australians, as simply passive victims. This is called the fallacy of victimhood. The First Nations had agency. They could act. They could choose what they could do. They might not have had the range of choices that others had, but they had agency. They weren't passive in the face of European expansion. They engaged with, they responded to, they acted. They weren't just acted upon. Linked to this is we need to be very, very careful to avoid teaching the frontier wars as simply a story of massacre after massacre after massacre, a story of massacre narrative. How many people died in this spot? We need to struggle with more than that. It's a story of resistance, of alliance, of collaboration, of cooperation, of everything that we would expect of warfare. There were sides, there were people who switched sides, there was casualties on both sides. So avoid the massacre narratives. Yes, there were massacres. There were awful, terrifying, horrible massacres of large groups of people. But let's not forget all of the other parts that went with that as well. So, while respecting the massacres, it's not a story of just massacres. Approaching the end of this sort of set of tips as we deal with the evidence is we need to respect silences, sometimes terrifying silences, where the story just ends. Respect those silences. It's often said that the victors of history, the winners of history, get to write the history books. The Indigenous voice in the historical record can be silenced quite often in this unit. The Indigenous voice is quieter, and we need to think about why that is. Does that mean that there is no other side to the story? Is it just a white story? Is it just a black and Indigenous story? Respect the silences, know why the story stops and starts in different places. Try to avoid speaking for First People in an attempt to fill the silence left by primary sources. We will grapple with oral sources here. First Nations, First People pass the stories of the frontier wars down in oral tradition. There is evidence there, but what is the place of oral testimony as opposed to diary entries of the time? Grapple with the evidence and respect the evidence. Think, feel, respond, use evidence, respect silence. Now, one last point about how do we respond? What do we do next? There's some very, very challenging parts of this history we're about to do. How you act after this is part of a personal journey for you to discover. Think about how you will respond to what you learn. I'd suggest the following for you. I'd suggest that to fully respond completely as a human, we need to spend some time reflecting on our values. I know I've had to do that. Try to live true to those values. That's a challenge. If we believe something is right, live to what we believe is right. Don't blindly accept anyone's say-so, mine or others. Be critical thinkers here. Use the evidence. That's core to being a historian. Rely upon the evidence and allow your thoughts to adjust as new evidence comes to light. Practice the skill of truth-telling, staying true to your values, true to the evidence, sharing that authentic history. And as Australians, I hope we get to the end of this, and I'd suggest we should get to the end of this unit, where we can celebrate the survival of these unbelievably vibrant, diverse, complex First Nations to come together in a sense of Makarrata after conflict, to resolve difference and to sort of live in harmony and love. That's what I think we should be heading towards here. I'm sure I wouldn't have expressed some of it well, but we're going to grapple with this very challenging history, and I want you to grapple with it in intensely personal ways, in the same way I sometimes am grappling to find just the right words.